All right, I'm going to start trying to share my screen. See if that works. Okay, so from beginning. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to do a short sort of what is open source presentation here, and then we'll go into the workshop where we're in breakout rooms. So this is open source with the TypeScript team. The four of us from Microsoft here are, I'm Nathan Shively Sanders, Andrew Branch, Ornithorox, and Ryan Kavanaugh are here too. So we'll do some short introductions and then move on with everything else. So actually, might as well stop sharing so we can see each other's faces a little bit better. I'm Nathan. I live in Redmond, close to Microsoft. It's really dark outside. I don't know if you can tell or not, but that's normal from Seattle at this time of year. I've been working at Microsoft for about 10 years, most of that on compilers and about half of that on TypeScript. Before that, I lived all over the country. I studied linguistics right before I got here. So I've done, I didn't go straight to Microsoft after studying programming or anything. So yeah, that's me. I think maybe Andrew, you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew. I live in San Francisco, as you can see from my background. I've been on the TypeScript team for coming up on 2 years now. My background is more in web development, so I'm relatively new to compilers as far as the whole team goes. I kind of fell in love with TypeScript as a user. And then when the opportunity came up to work on it, I jumped on it. So it's been really cool to be able to work in open source on a product that I already used and loved.
I can go next. I'm new to the TypeScript team because in comparison to everyone else, I'm new to Microsoft in comparison to everyone else. I used to work at Artsy, which was pretty New York based, which is why I was in New York. My focus generally within the context of TypeScript has been sort of documentation and the tooling which people use to sort of interact with TypeScript on the web. And so if you've ever tried to learn anything TypeScript wise, that chances are that's stuff that I've been touching lately. Other than that, I'm just here to help people fix bugs.
I'm Ryan Kavanaugh. I'm the dev lead for TypeScript. I've been working at Microsoft since 2004 and on TypeScript since I think 2012 or something. So long timer on both counts. I'm in Seattle, though don't be fooled by the mountains. And super excited to have the chance to bring open source to all these fellows. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for everyone.
All right, let me share my screen again.
Ooh, I want to use this reaction as feature.
Yeah, Teams doesn't have that. It's pretty great. Okay, so do I have to focus on? Oh, it's PowerPoint just being slow. Okay, well, welcome to Office 365. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to talk about what is open source really briefly, why open source, sort of for somebody new to software engineering, but also somebody who's in it for the long haul. How to choose a project once you've decided to contribute to open source, how to get started, and how to ask for help. And those last three are sort of rule of thumb checklists that I'll try to put in the Slack or maybe on GitHub afterwards. So don't worry if I go through them kind of fast. I'm eager to get to the workshops. All right, so what is open source? So there's sort of two ways of looking at it. One is software whose code is available, which that includes lots of things that you may not think of as open source, like Mac OS's core is open source, Android's core is open source. Probably your TV has large chunks of open source in it. And that means that you can get the source code and that somebody made it available in the past. The meaning that we normally talk about when we're talking about open source is actually software that's developed in the open. So not only can you get the source, you can actually show up and say, hey, I'd like to improve it, or hey, I have a feature request, and then you can have a conversation with the people who work on it. So as an example of that difference, like you can't necessarily go to an Apple engineer and suggest a new feature for Apple's user interface, but you can go to a VS Code engineer and suggest a new feature for VS Code. That's generally what people are talking about when they're talking about open source, is software that's developed in the open. And you can sort of see what's going on as part of the development, in addition to seeing the final product. So why open source? Why contribute to it, and why use it? As new programmers, as people who are new to the software industry, what you get from contributing to open source, there's sort of two big things. The biggest thing is that you get experience with software engineering. Those are things that are hard to teach in the classroom, but are still really important for a job in the industry. It's stuff like, once you have a bug, working with people to decide the right fix for the bug instead of just sort of coming up with a fix. It's jumping into new code that you don't know. So you'll have a whole bunch of code that maybe nobody knows how to work with. Jumping into it and figuring out what it does and how to change it is an important skill. A third skill is sort of figuring out when you're stuck, and figuring out who to ask for help and how to ask so that they can help you. And then finally, it's just sort of learning how projects are run technically in the terms of like build systems and things like that, but also who works with what on a particular project, and who's best to ask questions of, and things like that. And one important difference of open source compared to other things like an internship is that at the end you get a proof that you can put on your resume. It's really great to just have a link to say, hey, I did this, here's the link. And then people can go follow the link and see your conversations and see the code you wrote. Now, this isn't necessarily free. If you're a new programmer and open source is not part of your day job, it's essentially kind of free work. You're not getting paid for it. So there's a downside to it as well. But it is a good experience. So once you're in the software industry, why would you continue to like open source, or what are some long-term reasons to like open source? And I put, why does the TypeScript team like open source? But these are kind of my reasons. I'm sure that everybody else on the team has additional reasons. One thing is that cooperation is the default for open source. And what that means is that you sort of start by sharing things, even across companies. And you think you actually have to make the choice to make something secret. And making cooperation the default really changes the way you look at how you work, really all the way across the board. Another thing is that you get credit for your work, even if you work on a giant monolith like Microsoft Office or something like that. And even if the company owns your work at the end, you can get credit for saying, hey, I built such and such a feature. And people will know, for example, that you worked on automatic type acquisition on VS Code or something like that, as opposed to the old days where a product would have a feature and you really have no way to know who built it, even if you were a programmer yourself. A third reason is that you can submit bugs or fixes to anything that's open source that you use. And so you have greater peace of mind as a programmer when you decide to use something, because if something breaks, you can poke around, figure out what went wrong, and either complain to the right people to fix it, or fix it yourself and say, hey, I have this fix. Would anybody else like it? Could you put it in the actual product? And that's something you can't do without open source. And finally, learning new things is easier because you can just sort of look at how something is done in code and copy it. And that makes it a lot easier to get started with new areas of things. Okay, so that's sort of the background of why. Oh, that's right, there's a chat here. Okay, great. I'm reading the chat. And
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe fellows could leave questions in the chat, and I'll surface them as they come up.
Yeah, this is a pretty short presentation, so maybe I'll take a little bit of a few seconds for questions after that, after the presentation and before the groups start.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so, okay, how to choose a project. I think the most important thing is to choose something you use. Chances are you use a lot of open source as a programmer. And if you notice something that's broken or you wish that it did something else, then that's a good place to start. For example, if you use VS Code or some other editor and you notice that like finding in files doesn't work the way you want it to work, or it's really annoying that you can't click something, it's like some icon isn't big enough or something, that's a really small change. But it's something that you could go and open a bug and say, hey, does anybody else think this is a good thing to fix? And if they agree, then you can go and try to do it yourself. The other option is if you have a project that you use and like, you can go see if they have help wanted bugs on their repository. So you can say, go to GitHub and see if they have any bugs labeled help wanted. And those are usually good entry points. One rule of thumb is that it's going to be easier to contribute to a small project in a new project because there's going to be less code. There'll probably be fewer contributors and fewer maintainers. So if the maintainer is active, they'll be able to provide more advice than a large project with a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, let's see. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is a big long list. I think actually I may go over this in the group as we're going over it, but the basic way to get started is to find the README for your project and follow the setup instructions. If the project is on GitHub, then the README is the front page, and so you'll sort of have a basic starting point right there. Larger projects will often have a separate file called contributing. And then, like I said, I think I'm going to skip this part because just a bunch of detail about how to get testing, sort of a testing framework running. All right, so once you've started making a contribution, you may find that you're stuck and need to ask for help. So there's sort of two parts to this. You want to look for a place to get help. If the project you're working with is on GitHub, which most of them probably are at this point, then you can find the issue that you're trying to fix and start talking there. For large projects, there may be some separate chat room somebody has set up like Discord or something like that, that you can get help at as well. And then for small projects, if there's no other way to contact the maintainer, you might try something like Twitter. Sometimes that works, but a lot of maintainers are kind of overwhelmed. So someplace like GitHub is usually your first place to start. Once you've decided to ask for help, you sort of need four things. You want to start off by saying what you're trying to do. You want to copy links in and examples of what you've read so far, sort of what you've tried, why you've tried that. So you provide documentation. Basically, if you have a web page that says, oh, to use TypeScript such and such, try this, paste a link to that web page in your question so that the maintainers can sort of understand where you're coming from. Then you want to copy commands you ran or code that you wrote. So if you're calling some function and it isn't working or doesn't work the way you think it should work, actually put a piece of code in that shows what you actually wrote. And then show the bad output, whatever thing that's not working, show how it's not working, and preferably paste in some error or something that you're getting, and then add what you expected to see. Basically, if you add a bunch of details and examples, that makes it easier for the contributors to the project to compare what you wrote with sort of the example of what they think they would write. And that's a lot easier for people to help you with. So here's an example. This is from something Orto was actually doing this week. He's trying to learn how to write a JavaScript app for Linux. And so he found out that the GJS people, GNOME JavaScript, I think, had a matrix channel, which is sort of like Discord and sort of like Slack, I think. And so he asked a question here. So the question is, hi folks, is there a way to debug the initial source code lookup, which happens in imports.package.net? So right up front, there's the question. And then he says, I've been building a GJS app from scratch. So that's sort of what he's trying to do. And then here's the problem. I can't seem to get the imports inside blah, blah, blah to load. And then he says some additional steps he took. The G resource looks to be in the right place in the file system. And then finally, instead of showing the problems he ran into, he actually just gives a link to his example app or a small version of it. So that's the example for the maintainers to look at. So that's sort of a good example of providing quite a lot of detail when you ask a question. And that helps people who could answer your question get started on answering it. Okay, and I think that's all I've got for the slideshow. Let me jump back out of sharing for a minute and figure out where the chat, there's the chat, okay. So what's a good example of cross-company collaboration? Well, I can speak from my experience. So for TypeScript, we started off sort of as not exactly an internal project, but it was a project that was heavily used inside Microsoft and kind of used outside Microsoft. And over time, people outside Microsoft started using it more and more. And the team at Angular, the Angular team at Google decided that they wanted to have some kind of programming language that wasn't quite JavaScript. And after some back and forth and talking amongst themselves, they decided to work with TypeScript and try to make TypeScript the language that they could use. And so that led to TypeScript and Angular having regular meetings to figure out, okay, what can TypeScript do to make sure Angular is easy to use? And how can Angular work with TypeScript to make sure that new versions of new features from TypeScript show up in Angular, that kind of thing. And that's made a lot easier by all of TypeScript's source being online and our plans being online, so that it was sort of it's easier for them to see what we're doing without having to go through a lot of sort of back and forth paperwork between the two companies. I'm trying to think. I feel like there's examples of smaller companies working together as well.
Well, I mean, TypeScript gets PRs from all sorts of people, right? That level of collaboration is just kind of consistent. We end up hiring people for it that way too. So I guess it cooperates with Microsoft.
Yeah, that's sort of, yeah. I don't know if it's cross-company, but it's definitely sort of company-person interaction. I'm not sure exactly.
I think I'm not sure if a fellow had a question. I have a question. Who controls an open source project?
So it varies. The larger projects are, I would say, either controlled by a company or some sort of foundation, which is like a miniature company, but one dedicated to that project. The smaller ones are just sort of owned by individual people. And ownership there, so the owner still owns the project, and depending on how they have the project set up, sort of can control the direction of the project. I'm not sure if I'm answering this properly. Brian or to Andrew, do you want to maybe jump in on this one?
I mean, there's a few different meanings of control, and I think there's like the maintainers who are just getting code through, and then there's whoever kind of pays their paycheck, which might include no one. So that could just be a controller. Like, so for me, I'm like kind of the core maintainer for TypeScript, but like ultimately, I do work for Microsoft, and that's their project. Yeah, that's a lot of different answers, and it depends really on what the goals of the project are. So.
Yeah, a good example might be the GraphQL language. So if you take TypeScript is very much a Microsoft thing. Like it's like we dictate almost everything about what is majorly going to happen. But like GraphQL, on the other hand, was a Facebook thing, and then it went into open source as like a big foundation thing. So there is multiple companies that decide the future of GraphQL. There's like working groups. There's sort of tech teams for specific focuses. And in that case, it's like a highly collaborative. Facebook is only one of many people that are like peers and not necessarily like a singular vision of what the language could be. So like it could range drastically depending on like what the actual goals of the language are. Like, GraphQL as a programming language can evolve in many different ways, but TypeScript to some extent can only evolve with the language JavaScript. So those extra constraints actually make it easier for us to sort of have a bit more of a dictatorial approach to what the language looks like. And so having a set of core contributors in that case makes a lot more sense.
I think, or it sounds like you asked another question. Do you think working in the open has offered you new opportunities which you might not have had if you're working in closed source? I feel like for me, my perspective is biased by the fact that I've been working at Microsoft, a really large company, for a long time. Pre-open source, I talked to customers, but they were all inside of Microsoft, and so the circle of customers I talked to is pretty small, and the circle of sort of peers in the programming language, compiler, and query language, which was what I was working on at the time, a community were all pretty small. And when I switched to open source, suddenly I was talking to customers from everywhere, and I was talking to people sort of all across the programming language landscape, and all across the JavaScript landscape. So I just got to make a lot more connections between people, and I like that because I like talking to people about programming stuff. So.
Just asking everyone questions. Sorry, you're muted, Ryan.
How many incoming messages do we get on the TypeScript repo in a day? That should be roughly the number of notifications that I have right now, because I haven't done anything this morning. I have 50 notifications, and I stopped working at like 5 yesterday. So in 16 hours we got 50. So, and then it's going to pick up again. So we probably get like 100-ish comments a day, including ones from ourselves, which we're all pretty active. So.
That's a popular language, but like, well, luckily we can get to work on this full time. But there are projects that are about as popular that are just ran by people in their spare time too. Well, maybe not. It's hard to be as popular as TypeScript on any JavaScript library in theory, but it's a lot of incomings.
Yeah, so that's an important caveat when you are contributing to something. If it is run by volunteers, or even if it's run by full-time workers, you need to be aware that the people who are contributing are they may be really busy, basically. So if you contribute something, you may have to wait a while before somebody takes a look at it. So it's just sort of the reality of partially volunteer ecosystem.
I have a question to kind of piggyback off of that. Given that you get so many messages and notifications, is there anything that you do mentally with your workflow going through them? Like, how do you filter out ones that feel like they have more, there's something more substantial to them versus like, oh, I've seen this issue 30 times already. This person probably didn't look through the whole, issue list or search. Do you have a workflow for tackling those?
Not really. I just kind of look at them, and then as a maintainer, you have to give yourself permission to ignore stuff. So if someone shows up with a non-constructive comment, I just close the tab and move on, and that's really key. Is just like figuring out what requires a response and what doesn't is important. If someone logs an actual new issue as opposed to just leave a comment, like we do like triage every issue. I have a few saved replies that are basically like, this is the question, please ask it somewhere else. This is please give us more information, that kind of thing. I think since I get paid to do it, I don't find it too bothersome. So that's fine for me. I think for things that I've maintained kind of in my spare time, it's you have to give yourself permission to ignore stuff there too. So that's my workflow at least.
Duplicates do get really difficult in TypeScript. We passed the 40,000 issues open and closed. I guess that's combined with PRs recently. And TypeScript has like a lot of really specific lingo that maybe the average user doesn't necessarily know. And so if you're filing a bug, even if you do everything within your power to like search for duplicates, maybe you just like don't know some really obscure technical jargon that will actually lead you to the right thing. So yeah, finding duplicates can get tough. Like Ryan has been on the team forever, and so he is familiar with like most of them. But those of us who are newer like me, it takes a lot of searching and like slowly building up my memory of like common duplicates. But that is indeed a challenge.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask in terms of like the either like the governance structure or the decision-making process of how do you determine like what new features or like how updates to releases are determined, like in an open source collaborative environment. Like what's the process for that, or like what's the approach that's used most commonly?
I can speak to what our project does and then what other people do. In TypeScript, we adopted a calendar-based release model. So every 3 months we have a new release and there's kind of a defined cadence. Partner teams gave us feedback that they really liked having a predictable release schedule. In terms of what goes into the product, that's like a really interesting question because especially for us as a programming language, once something goes in, it can never come out realistically. So we take an approach that is like, add the smallest thing that we can that solves the problem, and then look at going forward, we're looking at what is the domain of unsolved problems that remains. So if I think about like the template literal type that just went in, the TypeScript type system is super expressive, but we didn't have a way to talk about like things that rename keys or change their types along the way, and it's all very like kind of specific to some certain frameworks. And we felt like that feature solved that problem and a host of other problems at the same time, like filtering out keys based on their name, that kind of thing. And so it's I think for us, it's a holistic understanding of like, what is the JavaScript ecosystem doing that our type system can't represent? What problems are people encountering in day-to-day practice? Like, there's some gaps in the type system where we have some holes, and it's like, well, are people actually hitting that hole? Is it important? Like, what feedback are we getting from people? And then also listening to like, kind of what our internal like dogfooding feedback is like, hey, this is slow. We should make it faster. So we try to make it faster. I think other projects have different governance models where they release more. I think if you're looking at like a non-corporate thing, you're going to see more of a like, there's enough bug fixes in here that I'm going to go make a new release today. Like that's how I run my personal projects. I'm like, oh, I fixed a bug, I'll do a new release because I only fix a bug every 3 months. So I think it's very dependent on the project, what the schedule is. But I think if you ask anyone like what is their process for adding and choosing new features, so I don't think anyone has no one's got a flow chart, right? It's all very holistic and ultimately comes down to a lot of kind of gut decisions based on a lot of experience.
Cool, thank you.
All right. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah, it just came up. Yeah. Oh, okay. He can go. Whoever.
I had a question with is GitHub the only open source, the only way to contribute to open source, or are there other ways?
So that's sort of an oddity of the present time, that GitHub really is like the dominant way of storing your source. There's a couple of competitors that work basically the same way as GitHub. You have an account, and then everybody puts their source in one place. It doesn't necessarily need to work that way. Like 20 years ago, open source didn't work the same way. But I mean, my answer is biased because I work on GitHub all day. But the answer is effectively, yeah. Everything's on GitHub-ish. There's a few things that are not, but basically everything's on GitHub. That may not continue to be the case. In a decade, maybe things look different, but right now, it's just sort of, you can assume things are on GitHub.
There's a lot of advantages to everything being on GitHub, in that you know the one place to go look to find things. You have that one sort of system for doing pull requests, for doing comments, for doing issues. There was a time period at the start of when GitHub was starting to become the one true place, which was that GitHub refused to add new features that changed the interface for about 5 years. And during that time, all these big projects started coming onto GitHub because it looked like a very solid, stable sort of tool for sort of putting big open source projects on. And now, realistically, the only people that are not doing it are people that have very, very strong views about how open source should work. So like there's some lacks in the idea that everybody should consolidate on GitHub. It's a little bit like the same problem that everybody consolidates on Facebook. Everyone searches only with Google. Like, you know, everyone doing everything in one way is not great at heart. But GitHub is that place for sure.
I think almost every project that's actually hosted elsewhere will just have like a placeholder GitHub page that's like, oh, we're actually on GitLab, we're actually on Bitbucket, we're actually wherever. So you can at least find it. It's nice.
Thank
I have
you.
a question. So with my question, it's related to like open source and how to build like a relationship rapport, in that you're not like it's like you want to improve a code or a bug, but you don't want to take over the original code that they had there. So it's like how do you kind of play that line of like helping but not like taking over and like steering elsewhere, you know?
Order, do you want to speak to that?
Who? I was going to say something, but
I nominate Orda.
Oh, Orda. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the way in which people contribute to open source tends to be in three ways, in my opinion. There are drive-by contributors. Like they come in, they make a tiny change, maybe like a typo fix, or like, you know, change the width of something. You know, they've got a perspective, but their entire goal is just to change this one entire thing. I've done this tons of times. And somebody like on the other side can tell that this is just a drive-by contribution. Like you basically don't even want to ask them to make any substantial change at all, because they might not even ever come back to actually make that change you've requested if you want to get it merged. So that drive-by contributors are like the first contributors you generally get to any project. So think about it straight up as, if you couldn't make any change in open source, people consider you a drive-by contributor. It's only when you've done 2 or 3 that people start to actually think, oh, maybe this is somebody that wants to be a bit more involved in the process and actually start to take some responsibility. So no one will ever intrinsically first think that you want responsibility. You have to either ask for it ahead of time, in which somebody will very likely be very suspicious of you, and then will slowly move your way forwards. So it's like it's a reputation-based system, and conceptually you start at 0 reputation almost every time. And so like until you've built up a big enough body of work that somebody can say, oh, it's this person and they've come in to do this one change, and we know that they've said that they're interested in the ecosystem, then that might turn into something further. Most of the time someone will just expect you to do it, go away, and then forget about ever maintaining it. The only times I've ever like ahead of time said to a drive-by contributor, this is something you're going to have to maintain, is when it's been something that's sort of either so far out of the original project vision that I don't think it's the sort of stuff I would ever touch or work on, but that I think it's valuable in the project. So a good example of this, I run a project called Danger, which allows you to sort of do some PR communication. I only use GitHub and I use GitLab occasionally, but I'm not going to maintain the GitLab side of that system. And so when someone came out of the blue and gave me an entire GitLab version of Danger, I said, like, all of the support requests for this for the next year, I'm going to send directly to you, because I can't maintain this because I don't understand the actual mechanisms of how it works.
Okay.
And so you have to make a really big change for someone to say that.
Okay.
I think you mentioned
the obvious. Go ahead, Ryan.
Go ahead. Okay. I think you mentioned a concern that I think was interesting, which was like taking over. I think as an open source maintainer, my assumption is always that no one is taking over my code ever. Like you can't. It can't happen. Like it's like, I don't think people running an open source project don't feel that way about their code. Like at least as I think about it, like a person coming in and making an improvement to my code, it's not even my code, it's like the code of the project. And that's kind of the spirit of open source. So, if you showed up to a project and were like, hey, I rewrote this entire file just from scratch for fun, I would just be like, well, why? But mostly in an open source setting, you're going to be like, well, I'm here to fix a bug, and I fix this bug. And, I've got a couple of contributors on TypeScript who have submitted there's a contributor named KingWL. They've submitted 5 different features at least. And when I get bugs on those features, they go to my dev team. I don't assign them to the contributor, because it's like, I don't know what their level of commitment is. And sometimes they come back and they're like, oh, I fixed that bug that I created. And I'm like, that's awesome, thank you. And conversely, I have a contributor, Alex, and they show up and they fix all the easy bugs that come in effectively. And they're fixing harder bugs now. And it's solely a good. I think it's just not, when I think about when I worked on class projects in school, yeah, you would have that feeling of oh, someone's mucking in my code. And I think at an open source, if an open source project gets successful, it's just not a problem. I don't know. It's like a great thing. It's like we just all are kind of in it together. So the one thing I will say, going back to, I think, kind of a previous question about building rapport, is the thing open source maintainers love is when you show up and fix a bug that they have asked someone to fix. When someone shows up with changes that are kind of either out of left field, although it's hard to tell if you're coming out of left field, but just kind of, if you start with work that they asked to be done, you'll be greeted with warm fuzzies and open arms. If you show up with I added this weird thing, this new button over here, you're going to get some sideways glances. And especially if like Order's talking about with reputation, like if you show up and do work that they've asked for, then when you later show up with like, here's my pet feature, that's going to be
Yeah, I'll just add that like with most open source interactions, there's definitely a human element there, where like maybe the first thing you do is like comment on an issue that you're interested in fixing. And just like, if you're like a nice, friendly person in that first interaction, like that goes a long way. Like working on TypeScript, it's like my job, and I work with a lot of people who come in. And so whether somebody comes in and wants to contribute and they're like very nice, or they're kind of like rude about what they're fixing or something, like whatever, it's my job. I'm going to like, you know, help them get the feature through. But it's just like a much more pleasant experience if like everyone is nice to each other. And that sounds like obvious, but you know, maybe you come to a repo and you are fixing a bug that like caused you a bunch of pain, and so you're frustrated. But just like entering that relationship, you know, remembering that there's, you know, humans on both sides, can really like get things started on the right foot. And 99% of the time, like both Ryan and Orda mentioned, like open source maintainers are busy. And so if you are like showing up and willing to help in good faith, like that's awesome. Almost everyone is going to be really receptive to that, and really grateful.
I realize now that I was like, there's 3 types of contributors, and then I never gave anything other than the first one. To give you the classifications in my head, there's the drive-bys, and then there's contributors, and then there's core contributors. And so like core contributors are the sort of people that I would give Slack access to or Discord access to, like private channel sort of stuff, where they can ping you at any time, and that is culturally okay. That's mainly the difference, and all of those are about the amount of responsibilities that they take on and the amount of ownership of the project that like either I want to give away or that they would like to take.
Okay.
Joseph, did you have a question a ways back?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I think looking at the feature of TypeScript again, do you have contact with TC39, or is it more a reactive process, whereas you just see what happens and then people issues pop up, or yeah?
So yeah, we've gotten better about that. I think we have 2 people that regularly show up to the meetings, and we basically oh yeah, Alejo says, what's TC39? Yeah, so TC39 is the committee for JavaScript. So TypeScript is typed version of JavaScript. We have to implement whatever JavaScript implements. And so whenever new features come into JavaScript, we have to make sure they work with TypeScript. The truth is, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've spent a lot of effort making sure that new things get into JavaScript that we would like to see, and also that any new features that come into JavaScript are things that work well with TypeScript. So yeah, we work with them. We're part of the committee basically. That's been more or less true, but I think one of the big differences in the last 2 or 3 years is that TypeScript has gotten big enough that everybody on the committee thinks about TypeScript a little bit when they're designing features. So it's not just us anymore. It's sort of everybody on the committee mostly that thinks about it. And Ryan says, yeah, so TC39 is a industry consortium committee. So it's like an independent foundation. Well, it's not a foundation. It's an independent body that's part of a standards foundation. So it's been going for 20 plus years now, something like that.
Thank you.
So that actually does lead to an interesting question that someone else should answer, which is like, so if TC39 are the ones deciding JavaScript. What does that mean for TypeScript?
So I'm not sure I understand your question. What does it mean for TypeScript?
Well, if like, what does it mean? What is the domain of TypeScript then? If like the TypeScript doesn't really get to control the language in which it actually runs.
Right. Okay. So the quickest way to say that is that the domain of TypeScript is types. So everything after the colon in TypeScript is a type, and we sort of control that. And so if you notice, a lot of the fancy features in the last few versions have been things like conditional type. Well, conditional types are actually pretty old, but they're conditional types, which are basically like an if statement except for types. And then there's mapped types, which are like loops except for types. And then there's template literals, which are like template strings except for types. So if you notice, those all kind of sound like things of a programming language, except they're only for types. So sort of the reason you'd use TypeScript in the first place is to say, I have a whole bunch of JavaScript, or I want to write a new program that runs in JavaScript. Let me have types for it so that I can have some safety and get red squigglies when I make mistakes and things like that. And so when we add a feature, it's basically to help you do that, is to add more types to your program. And in practice, what that means is we've been sort of reinventing programming constructs, except only for types. And then Alejo says, could they part ways at some point? The short answer is no, because we have no plans to do that, and it wouldn't really make sense for us to do that. TypeScript is open source. There's people who could take TypeScript and make it compile to something else, and then they could start adding their own features. But for the TypeScript community as it is today, the value is you can write JavaScript but have some types. And as soon as TypeScript stops being JavaScript, it's not valuable for the people who are using it, really, because they're not going to be able to use JavaScript packages, and they won't be able to have new people that only know JavaScript suddenly switch over to TypeScript really fast, because there's not too much to learn right now. Like I think there's somebody who's made TypeScript compile to WebAssembly. There's somebody who's made TypeScript compile to some weird internal languages. People have compiled TypeScript to weird stuff, but they don't really work with JavaScript anymore. So it's really niche, pretty much. Oh,
I think the
and Ord
divergence
has a
question
YouTube
is
video.
super interesting.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So somebody said something.
Well, yeah, because people advocated for us to diverge a lot back in the early days, because especially back in 2013, ECMAScript, the committee was not doing a lot of innovation, and people said, hey, why don't you just like make a clean break and go off, add all cool features, fix up, make it so that this works the way you expect it to, all this other stuff, and just make a new language, and that'll be awesome. And I think like we could have taken that choice, and I don't think we would have, we wouldn't be here if that had happened. But we always could, but we've made the decision that we absolutely won't. So that's where we're at.
There are languages that have made that decision, and they're doing all right, but they're just separate languages at the end of the day. The further away from JavaScript the language becomes, the more you have to truly understand that gap. And as that gap gets further and further, the actual value proposition of that language actually gets a little bit further and further away too, from being able to run in a website or being able to run in Node. That's why you see like cool sounding languages like Reason ML or Dart that fix a lot of JavaScript's problems, that don't have like mass adoption in the same sense as like TypeScript. Simply because they are great languages, all of them. They are further away from JavaScript in order to fix JavaScript's flaws. Whereas TypeScript is it lives with the idea that those flaws are part of what makes JavaScript JavaScript, and has to sort of work around them sometimes, or just allow them to exist.
So do we have any more questions? So if we don't have any more questions, I don't know how, Aliko, maybe you can put us into breakout rooms. I assume it's probably gonna be sort of random. I don't know.
Yep, absolutely. I think I have made the breakout rooms. I had initially intended like every every TypeScript team member have 2 fellows. I think one fellow had to drop because he had a commitment, but he said that he might come back. So I think one of you will have only 1 person to work with. The other will have 2. And I'm gonna open the breakout rooms. You will see a pop-up come up asking you to join. Just feel free to join there. And this is exciting because we are, we were talking about the conversation about like a very high level. Now all the fellows, you're gonna get to see how that happens hands-on, and what some of that means. So excited for this section. I'm gonna hit open rooms, and you'll be able to join. If you have any questions, Slack is the best way to reach me, reach everyone, and we'll troubleshoot from there. Cool.
TypeScript to the compilers, probably one of the hardest places to contribute. We just did it because that's where we work all day, but there's way easier projects to contribute to. And probably we should have started there, but I think you were working on the website, right, Orta?
Yeah, I mean, you make that sound like it was going to be easy to get set up and run with its massive 2 dependencies of Yarn and Node 13. But, you know, we found our own ways to struggle. The last half an hour, we just did it running off my computer and got maybe close to what we were looking for.
Any other teams want to share how it went?
I'll share. So I remember earlier, like when we first were talking and you spoke about the importance of like working with someone that's like pretty nice and like cool. Working in groups are like, you know, I feel like every time like it just emphasizes the importance of like collaboration and like group dynamics, because like, you know, some like working with someone who's like probably like just not like it's not like a pleasing experience. Like even something as like small as like or not small, but like a bug can like just drive the whole like team crazy. But I think if like there's a good group dynamic and balance, like even if it takes an hour, like it's still like a pleasurable hour and like you're able to learn something regardless. So that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, computer frustrations everybody feels, so there's no need to take it out on each other, right?
Yeah, I think I was also with Udwaka Abasi in order. Every time we hit a bug, we just laughed it off. I feel like to another person that probably could have been annoying, but to us, I mean, what else could we have done other than to just laugh it off? Honestly, but yeah, it was a dope experience.
Awesome. And anyone from Andrew's team?
I think it was really dope because we like actually got to see how the bug got fixed. Even though we didn't get to run it locally, we actually was successful, I think, in solving the bug at the end, which is pretty cool. I think I learned a lot from that experience.
Yeah, and I think it was a lot of like playing around and not knowing like what the right one was going to be. So like we had to call like another what do you call it, attribute for like the type tag. So we originally did type dot tag name, but that covered the whole line of code, but we only wanted the actual input, like the value. So we just had to play around with like type expression and then dot type, and we just had to play around to see what we wanted to get back and what it was giving us. So it was a lot of like just trial and error, and I think that's like really important when you're in developing, because you're not going to get the answer right away. You're gonna have to try different things, and then you're also gonna have to try things that you didn't know about. So that may take like a little research of a keyword or something like that to see what kind of properties, that's the word I was looking for, to see what properties that was using. So it was pretty cool.
You just described the strategy I've used to fix every bug I've fixed in TypeScript in the last 2 years.
I think one thing that I was really awestruck by was the fact that TypeScript was really similar to JavaScript, and it's a lot of like about objects, and that's what we deal with in JavaScript.
Yeah, once we actually figured out that TypeScript was like using the objects, then we were like, okay, well, maybe we have to key into it a little further And that's how we solved the bug. So it was pretty cool. Yeah.
I mean, for me, if anything, it really like encouraged for me an appreciation of like how much work is put into open source projects, and how much like intuition and nuance to really being able to serve something that works for users, and like this like how critical is this like collaborative milieu in terms of addressing bugs and getting things done and moving forward, and just all the hard work and effort that and dedication that requires. And so to see that in play was even if it was just for this issue, this bug was really cool for me.
Yeah, and kind of just like going off of what Nilbert said, like that appreciation, because I mean, like when we looked at the one with like the 40,000 lines of code, I was just like so like I was like, whoa. And then like even going off of what Ashia said, where it's like it's not all about coding, like it's about like the research and like just learning new things and that experience about it. So I definitely was able to appreciate like all the work that goes on like under the hood as well, getting to see that. So that was cool.
Yeah, just to add on to that, unlike everyone else, getting to see how developers work on such large bases of code, and the mindset you have to be in, and that kind of workflow, that mental process of how to tackle things, kind of knowing like a little bit of trusting your instincts already once you're a little familiarized, but also with the code base, but also just kind of knowing off the top of your head what resources you have at your disposal, like who to ask, or like just knowing how things are done. But yeah, just getting that insight was really great here. I'm really thankful for this. Thanks, Ryan.
Cool. Thank you everyone for coming. And thank you to the Microsoft team. I feel like, I was a fellow myself, and I always say that working with volunteers and with all of you was one of the most impactful parts of my journey. And I'm glad that this newer cohort is also having a similar experience, and truly making us feel very special, having all of you here. TypeScript being one of the programming languages that is rising in ranks on GitHub and in the world, and having all of you knowing that work there is making us feel really special. And thank you for letting us pick your brains and to showing us, guiding us through how to break into open source, and not to be afraid that you could look at it, you could play, as all of you mentioned. So yeah, let's get a round of applause for Ryan, Orda, Andrew, and Nathan.
You're welcome, folks. It's our pleasure too.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It was a lot of fun.
I think we're going to leave the Slack channel open for a while, at least another day or so. So if you have other questions or something, probably one of us will pick it up and be around.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if not, we're all very accessible. Just rake an issue on the TypeScript repo, and Ryan will have to see it. Just rake an issue on the TypeScript repo, and Ryan will have to see it.
Cool. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you have a nice rest of the day. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good one.